Today we are going to discuss a topic which would fall under this paper Indian Politics 2, and the title of this module is Nehruvian Consensus and After. The content writer name is Dr. Chanchal Kumar Sharma, who teaches in Central University, Haryana, and the paper coordinator have been two people, two eminent professors, Professor Rekha Saxena from Delhi University and Professor Sanjay Lodha from Udaipur, MLS University, Mohanlal Sukhadia University, Udaipur. And I am Ashutosh Kumar. I am a national coordinator of EPG Pathshala in the subject of political science. So let us discuss the topic. As I said, the module is titled Nehruvian Consensus and After. So the first thing is that what do we mean by Nehruvian consensus? Is it like Nehru's consensus or a consensus among the political class after India became decolonized? I rather like to put it like the consensus which informed India's political imagination after independence. So it was not merely Nehru, but also a whole set of political leadership who took over the charge of the destiny of independent India. And when we talk about this so-called Nehruvian consensus or the consensus, we talked about so many things. We talked about consensus about India, the need of India to go for democratic socialism, to go for secularism, agrarian distribution, planned economy, rapid industrialization, the policy of non-alignment and neutrality in a bipolar world. In fact, if you see the Indian democracy, there have been certain foundational principles of India's democracy, as Nirja Gopal Jayal, a professor of JNU, argues in the introduction of her very celebrated work, Democracy in India, published from Oxford University Press. She talks about the foundational principles of India's democracy. You can refer also to Sunil Khilnani, Idea of India. You can also refer to the Rajiv Bhargava and other political analysts. They all have spoken about the certain democratic fundamentals, certain foundational principles which became the basis for the democracy making, or which became the basis for the democratic journey, democratic career of India, as Varshney puts it. What were those fundamentals which have been the base for India's democratic journey? One can refer to principles like federalism, secularism, democracy, development, welfare. So democracy, development, welfare, secularism, federalism, they have been the base which became the basis for the democratic journey of India in troubled times. When India became independent, we all know that India's democratic journey was not going to be free from all kinds of obstacles. India was largely poor, India was largely illiterate, India didn't have any democratic history, India did not become democracy because of any democratic revolution like that. There was a nationalist movement which was for independence, but it was not a kind of radical movement. There was no radical departure in the form of the nationalist movement. We also can refer the absence of a kind of experienced political class, absence of democratic history, the lack of industrial development, very low level of literacy. So all these factors, in fact, if you mention the factors which could be considered as inimical or which could be considered as threatening to the success of India's democracy, India was full of those factors. As I said, to again recapitulate second time, that India had a very low level of literacy, India had a very low level of industrial development, India didn't have developed middle classes, India never had a democratic history, India had a very inexperienced political class which was much more experienced in launching the agitation rather than governing the society, a difficult society like India with so many difficult problems. So you can say that India's democracy, and India was surrounded by non-democratic regimes. As you know, democracy thrives in a democratic neighborhood, and India's neighborhood was anything but democratic. As you know, the Pakistan, which was part of India, did not really remain democracy for a long period. So for the success of India's democracy, one has to give credit to the leaders like Nehru and his colleagues, who really nurtured India's democracy. And when we talk about Nehruvian consensus, we also argue that, in fact, if you refer to the debates in the Constituent Assembly, there were Gandhiites and there were conservatives and there were people like Nehru who believed in a democratic India, a modern India, an industrialized India, and who did not really believe in going back to the village India or something like Gram Swaraj and all. So that way we can say the dominant paradigm, the dominant thinking about the future of India's democracy at that time was very much influenced by the ideas of Nehru and the political thought of Nehru. Now when we refer to the period after the independence, we can see that after the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi, which was such a great setback to the Hindu nationalist forces, and also after the death of Sardar Patel, gradual ascendance to the power of Nehru's increasing hold over the party machinery, and also his being the prime minister of the country. We refer to, like, the first thing I would like to say that what kind of idea Nehru had about India's democracy. As we all know, Nehru started as a Fabian socialist, but as a Prime Minister of India, increasingly, despite the influence of socialism and despite his going for a development planning model, Nehru-Mahalanobis model and the Awadi plan and the Bhubaneswar resolutions, Nehru also believed in parliamentary federalism. Nehru was a great institution builder in that sense that Nehru as a prime minister would be always sitting in the parliament, and under his leadership the Congress, despite being a dominant party, despite the opposition parties being fragmented, not really cooperating with each other, the Congress as a ruling party gave adequate space and time to the opposition parties to express themselves, and Nehru as a prime minister would greatly respect the parliament as an institution. He would be attending the parliament. Maulandkar was the speaker of the Lok Sabha, and Nehru would allow himself to be subjected, himself to be directed by Maulandkar in the parliament, and that was a great lesson for other lawmakers also, to take the parliament as a truly law-making body, as a truly representative of the diverse opinion which prevailed in the then India. And then even in terms of the federation, Nehru was in favor of parliamentary federalism, and the states were, though most of the states, I think almost all the states, being ruled by the Congress party, but Nehru as a prime minister, as the topmost leader of the party, would take care to write letters to the chief ministers explaining the decisions of the central government headed by him. And so there was a strong center, but there was also this idea about cooperative federalism. So it was not that state emergency would be imposed with impunity. In fact, the first time Nehru government went for Article 356 in a controversial manner was in 1959, when the CPI-led government in Kerala was dismissed under Article 356 on certain grounds which became debatable. So otherwise, there was no attempt in order to rob it or in order to, and there were many powerful state-level leaders during Nehru time, and they were allowed to continue in the powerful position. So the Nehru influence was on shaping the parliamentary federal democracy in India, to giving autonomy to the state government, and also at the same time strengthening the central government for the purpose of bringing about the balanced economic growth all over India. There was also an attempt to have a mixed economy model, that the private sector as well as the public sector economy, they can both complement each other, both can flourish. But the main emphasis was on the central planning, because Nehru was of the opinion that in India we should have a socialistic pattern of society, and by socialistic pattern of society, Nehru believed in eradication of poverty. He believed in the redistribution of the resources so that the gap between the rich and the poor could be minimized, and he also believed that the key economic sector, the heavy industries and all, transportation, energy, aviation, that should be brought under the control or the regulation of the state center. So one of the major feature of India's economy under the leadership of Nehru was that there was no attempt to take away the property of the rich people. At the same time, and also the interest of the powerful dominant classes were not really hurt. And you would agree, as Atul Kohli also argued, that no democracy can succeed if it takes away the interest of the property classes, or the powerful economic interest groups cannot be disregarded. So that was done. But at the same time, the Nehru administration was also keen to accommodate the interest of the poor people. There was a long-term vision. So the economic policy making was not being done in order to the next election. For example, Nehru administration gave more emphasis on the heavy industry. What was the rationale behind it? Why the industrial sector was preferred over the agricultural sector? Because it was thought that the industrial sector would bring in more employment. It was thought that the industrial sector would have a greater potential for growth. It was thought that the heavy industries in particular should be promoted, because once the heavy industries are promoted, the ancillaries, the smaller industrial units automatically would thrive up in order to support the heavy industry. There was a great emphasis on creating the human capital. IITs were opened, IIT, IIM, Indian Institute of Management, Indian Institute of Technology, the universities were opened, the engineering colleges were opened, science education was promoted. So there was an attempt to make India a literate country and a country with highly qualified people. The space program and all, it was like this. See, like one of the major factor, one of the major contribution of Nehru was that he ensured that the military would be kept under the civilian control. He also, his foreign policy, because Nehru was the foreign minister of India also. He was not only the prime minister, and for a certain period he was also finance, he was looking after the finance also. So Nehru had a multiple role, not merely being the prime minister. So if you see the foreign policy, there is a clear-cut Nehruvian imprint on the making of the foreign policy of India is concerned, which has in many ways continued even now. Nehru adopted the non-alignment policy. At that time, the world was divided into two: the Soviet bloc, erstwhile Soviet bloc, and the American bloc, so-called the capitalist bloc and the socialist bloc. But Nehru insisted that India, a poor country, needing the support of all the countries for its nation-building effort, and also to keep away from this ongoing arms race and wasting its energy and capital on building arms rather than building dams and building the cities like Chandigarh. It was much more prudent to adopt a policy of non-alignment, to have the principles of the Panchsheel. And also Nehru did a great job in enhancing the image of India across the world, and he emerged as a truly world statesman or the leader of the world. So one thing, another very important point when we think about the Nehruvian imprint on India's economy and the Nehruvian thing, consensus, that was that the Indian government, the Indian state did not really exploit the agricultural sector to develop the industrial sector. So yes, as I said, there was emphasis on developing the industrial sector, but the industrial sector was not developed at the cost of the agricultural sector. So the money was needed, capital was needed in a country like India. So from where the money came? Money came in the form of very high level of taxation. Money came in the form of the foreign aid, because India was a non-aligned country, so India was helped out both by the Soviet bloc countries as well as by the capitalist bloc countries led by USA. So you had the steel factories, factories like the HEC, Ranchi, Bokaro, Rourkela, Bhilai, they all came because of the support of the foreign countries. So that was another factor which really helped Indian industrial economy to flourish. And the third thing was the very high level of savings by the Indians. So there lies the contribution of Nehru. But of course one can refer to the limitation of his efforts in the economic field, and in the sense that the land reforms, though India was successful, Indian government was successful in bringing the first constitutional amendment, introduction of the 9th schedule, so many land reform measures, Jamindari Abolition Act, Land Ceiling Act, they were passed. But in reality, because of the indifference of the state-level governments, state-level leaders, and because of the kind of social basis of political power in village India, the land reforms did not really succeed much. Though there was always insistence on the need to have a much more egalitarian society and to fight against the poverty and to bring about both democracy and development. Another contribution of Nehru would be that he was very insistent on the secular nature of India's democracy, because Nehru was of the opinion, even after partition, he was of the opinion that the greatest threat to India's unity and integrity and the greatest threat to India's progress was if there would be a rise of communal forces, if there would be a rise of the Hindu-Muslim divide, and not only recognize the differences, but also to accommodate the differences and to give them representation. So whether you have the 8th schedule, many languages, you have the rights given to the religious minorities in the constitution, and also the overall, like the affirmative and the substantive affirmative policies for the minorities, social and religious as well as the cultural minorities in the constitution. There you can see the influence of Nehru, because Nehru, as a very prominent Constituent Assembly member, along with Ambedkar, Pant, Sardar Patel, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, Patabi Sitaramaiah, and others, he played a very important role. In fact, if you refer to the Constitution, the preamble, the objective resolution was presented by Nehru in 1946, and it was his objective resolutions which became mostly, almost the same text was used as a kind of preamble of the Constitution. So you refer to the Hindu Code Bill also, the reformist agenda of Nehru, the land reforms as well as the social reforms. What after Nehru? If you see, the Nehruvian imprint continues in the foreign policy affairs, in the sense that even during Lal Bahadur Shastri or during the regime of Indira Gandhi, India continued to remain non-aligned. India remained one of the top leader of the non-aligned movement, and India's impartiality more or less was recognized and appreciated all over the world. But in fact, in other areas, in terms of federal governance, there was a marked change, because you can see that during the Indira Gandhi period and subsequently during Rajiv Gandhi period, there was much more emphasis on centralized federal polity. The center was made too powerful. The state parties were not really seen with approval. There was an attempt on the part of the state to interfere in the state affairs, not really allow the state parties to rule even when they won the elections. Misuse of the constitutional provisions like Article 356 and dismissal of the properly elected government. So that was also done. Hope for the poor, there was an attempt to accommodate their interest, which was not there during the Indira Gandhi period. During Indira Gandhi period, poverty became a kind of political issue, and there was much more emphasis on populism. There was much more emphasis on economic populism, sloganeering, giving the election promises in the economic field without any programmatic efforts. That was not the case in the Nehruvian India. There was a real attempt to implement the land reforms. There was a real attempt to redistribute the resources. Nehru should be remembered for the community development program, for the public distribution system. Nehru should be remembered for the real attempt to bring about long-term economic change, economic development in India. And in fact, during Nehru period, there was always insistence on having a kind of secular nationalism. There was no compromise on the principle of secularism, something which was not really adhered to by Indira Gandhi in the last phase of her regime. So that way we can say that even now, if you refer to the today's India, you can say that Nehruvian consensus in many ways has been broken. Now the consensus about development, consensus about secular secularism, consensus about majoritarian democracy in the sense that the majority would be decided on the basis of issue and not on the basis of community or identity. All these, the consensus on all these issues has been broken. Now we have lots of debates and lots of differences over the issue of secularism, which is for many people considered like a minority appeasement. There is insistence on majoritarian democracy, and the majority is being defined in terms of identity rather than on the basis of issue. And we also have a short-term vision, whether it's the economy or it's a politics. Electoral politics has taken over. There is hardly any long-term vision for making of modern India or for rebuilding India. So there, I think that if we refer to Nehru should be remembered for establishing the foundational values of India's democracy. Nehru should be remembered for always respecting the constitutional values, not really having any many ingredients considered necessary for the success of democracy. In fact, many theorists have argued that India's democracy was not supposed to be successful given all kind of obstacles. So if Indian democracy has succeeded, if the idea of democracy has got embedded in the minds of the people, if the democracy in a procedural sense, if the political democracy has gone from strength to strength, then the contribution to a large extent also goes to, it can be attributed to the contribution of the leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and also his colleagues. There were so many tall leaders like Maulana Azad, Govind Ballabh Pant, Lal Bahadur Shastri. So Nehru was not alone. When we say Nehruvian consensus, it is not only Jawaharlal Nehru. It is a whole set of leaders who thought alike, who were convinced about the need to have a strong democracy, need to have a socialistic pattern of society, need to have a secularism, need to nurture all those foundational principles which were envisaged by our constitution and the constitution makers. The leaders like Nehru, we were lucky to have the political leaders like Nehru, and many countries where the popular leaders, they turned into authoritarian rulers. They became the responsible for destruction of democracy. Whereas Nehru, despite being very popular, despite being a man in hurry, despite being very ambitious about the future of India, and despite being conscious that he needed faster reforms in the political and the economic life of India, he always followed the canons of the parliamentary democracy. He listened to the opposition voices. He always listened to the constitutional propriety, constitutional decorum. So there, Nehru we remember as the democratic, truly democratic, secular leader who nurtured India's democracy in the most crucial phase of India's democracy. Thank you.